All right. Well, I've got two after. We've got a lot to talk about today, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for hopping on with us this Tuesday afternoon. My name is Duane Breijiak. I use he, him pronouns. I think most of y'all know me. I'm the executive director for NASW Michigan, and I am excited today to be joined by a couple of our fabulous ethics committee members to talk about hot topics in social work ethics. There is never a shortage of things to talk about in social work, and ethics is always swirled in to all the work that we do. There's a lot going on in the world and in the state that is causing us to have new and renewed ethical dilemmas. So we're hoping to have some input from y'all about what you're hearing about or seeing in your practice, share some maybe updated research or numbers with y'all, and then talk about some of what we're hearing at the state level as it relates to some of the social work ethics our colleagues are facing. So as we kind of get started today, I just want to talk through some of our framework for where we'll be coming from. So currently in the United States, we have about almost 750,000 social workers across the United States. We're still projected to be one of the fastest growing professions over the next 10 years. And our schools of social work overall are having a resurgence in many of their recruitment and retention efforts at our schools of social work. We saw a little dip during the pandemic, but that has kind of rebounded, and our dips were generally lower than a lot of the other areas across our academic institutions. In Michigan specifically, we have around 31,000 licensed social workers in Michigan. We are in the top 10 states in terms of number of licensed social workers, and we add about 10,000 new folks each decade, and kind of where that puts us in relation to the other behavioral health professions in our state specifically. So we have about 31,000. Our second largest group of behavioral health folks are our licensed counselors in Michigan. We have just over 11,000 licensed counselors in Michigan. So we're almost 3 times the second largest group of behavioral health. So by far, there are more social workers than any other group in Michigan. Our psychologists are a little over 7,000, and our marriage and family therapists are a little over 800. So combined, we have almost 50,000 behavioral health professionals in Michigan, but that still is not enough to fill the need that we know we have, not just here in Michigan, but broadly. Nationally, and what this looks like for the future of our profession, we have a little over 60,000 students who are going through MSW programs across the United States. In Michigan, we are home to 13 MSW programs, accredited MSW programs, and that is around 2,500 MSW students in our state. There's an additional roughly 4,000 bachelor's level students in Michigan. So we are pumping out social workers every year. We know we just had a recent cohort graduate a couple of months ago. If any of you are on, congratulations, welcome to the profession. And what we're seeing from the national CSWE data, the Council of Social Work Education, is our workforce is diversifying racially across the United States. Historically, we've been a very female, white-dominated profession, but those demographics are shifting in particular parts of the country more rapidly than others. And then kind of the chart you see on the bottom is kind of the specialized area that our MSW students tend to be focused in. Not surprisingly, the largest chunk of folks are focused in behavioral health or mental health, then children, youth and families, and then school social work. That would be no real surprise, I think, to most of us on, and probably would be reflective of Michigan's numbers if we had a breakdown specifically of Michigan. I think we'd have a slightly higher percentage of folks in the macro role than some of our national colleagues, just because we have macro licensing here, and some of our programs have pretty strong macro concentrations. But what we see is pretty consistent across most of the country. And how we think about the Code of Ethics as this relates into this, the Code of Ethics is something as you apply for your social work program. I know I had to write an essay to get into my MSW program that incorporated the Code of Ethics, but it really is our foundation that defines our values as a profession. The Code of Ethics has been around since 1960. If you haven't seen it before, this is what the original Code of Ethics looked like. It was one pager and had just kind of our initial framework and guidance as a profession. And this was passed in the Delegate Assembly in October 1960. And obviously, since that time, it has been updated and revamped and added to throughout the last 6 decades. As we go through this slide, we'll make sure that the slides are available to everybody today, as well as a lot of the resources you can find on socialworkers.org/ethics. That is our national kind of repository for all things ethics. One of the things that I did not really get a full grasp of when I was going through my social work education was who actually writes the code of ethics and where does it come from, and how, as a social work community, do we play a role in changing and updating our guideposts every few years. And not surprisingly, our code of ethics is written by social workers, not by the entity of NASW. It's written by our membership. It's written by our delegate assembly. And every 3 years, there is a process called delegate assembly, which is our representative voting block as an organization. Every state gets a certain amount of voting members based off of their chapter size. In Michigan, we get 9 delegates out of the roughly 220 that exist across the country. So there are really 3 parts of the delegate assembly process that any social worker potentially can be a part of as it relates to our ethical revisions. There's a public comment period that happens during all the revision periods, and that is open to all of our membership, where folks can create comments, write new chapters or suggestions, and that is open for several months in the delegate year, which our next year will be 2026. So we expect to see some of this comment period open likely in early 2026. There also is a National Ethics Committee and Task Force. These are the folks that do the behind-the-scenes work on drafting the updated Code of Ethics and really looking year by year at what suggestions we want to make sure are included in the next iteration of our code. And then finally is the delegate assembly itself. Those are our voted membership. So I'm just going to skip ahead really quick to a couple of slides. These are our delegates here in Michigan. There are, like I said, 9. 1 is our board president always, and then the rest are elected members from you all. These folks were just elected and started their terms July 1. And we'll have opportunities to engage with our full Michigan community over the next couple of years as we build up to our delegate assembly. I'll come back to this slide in a minute too, but we really appreciate all of these folks stepping forward and being our representative voice as a Michigan community. Our most recent updates to our Code of Ethics really focus on 2 primary things. The 2017 Code of Ethics revision focused on technology and changes within social work practice, and the 2020 revisions focused on self-care and making sure there was more definitive language around that within our Code of Ethics. What I would anticipate seeing in this next iteration is there has been a lot of state and national conversations around making sure we're including more workforce-friendly language, whether that's around collective bargaining, compensation, all of those sort of pieces directly into our code. So we want our social work community to make sure we're providing really good insight from our Michigan community as those revisions come open. So again, this is our delegates for next year. You'll have a chance to get to know them all over the next couple of years as they onboard into their roles, and we have more public-facing events with them. We'll likely see something at the LEAD conference in October and some standalone webinars to provide insight into policies and the Code of Ethics revisions as those come up. And as it relates to the Code of Ethics, one of the things that I've gotten asked a few times at NASW, as it relates usually to licensing related questions, are all social workers required to follow the NASW Code of Ethics, or is that just if you are a member of NASW? And that, I will say, varies a tiny bit state to state, depending on how your state law is written and regulations. But in Michigan, our state regulation does mandate that all social workers must follow our professional code of ethics, which is our NASW Code of Ethics. So regardless of if folks are a member of the organization or not, they do need to abide by our professional code of ethics that is outlined in our state law. We'll have plenty of time for some questions, but I want to have our first kind of open-ended question to y'all. I want to hear what you all are thinking right now in the field. But what are the most common ethical violations or sanctions that you would expect to see in our Michigan community? I'll give folks a few minutes to drop some things into the chat. I see some good stuff coming in here. Dual relationships, boundary violations, billing violations, boundaries, dual relationships, a lot of boundaries in dual relationships, sex with clients, failure to complete CEs, boundaries, not reporting suspected neglect and abuse, not maintaining confidentiality, acceptance of gifts, dual relationships, lack of CE credits. I'm surprised people put the CE ones. I thought that one would get missed by folks, but we do definitely see that in there. Confidentiality. Oh, these are great. So as we kind of move into the next section, I want to just give a little bit of data around what we know so far, because really we have not had transparent data related to ethical violation, and we haven't really had folks doing much research in this area in the past couple of decades. So we have started a project here at the chapter level to look at the last 10 years worth of data at least and get what we could find, as well as we've been partnering with some researchers out of Western Michigan who have been looking at all of the health professions in Michigan and doing kind of a cross-sector analysis and comparison of sanctions and violations across not just social work, but medical, nursing, psychology. So y'all hit most of the ones right on here. The main ones we see: documentation issues, boundaries and dual relationships. We'll absolutely talk through some of these specifically with our ethics committee folks. Impairment and substance use related issues, continuing education, and licensure violations. So in the last decade, we have had roughly 60,000 complaints filed against healthcare providers in Michigan. Most of those were not social work complaints, but total across all of the health licenses, which there are 23 health licensed professionals in Michigan, around 60,000 total complaints. Of those, around 20% resulted in some sort of a sanction, so around 12,000. In Michigan, you can see here on this chart, we have anywhere from 38 to 89 folks who are getting actually sanctioned in any given year. And our numbers of folks who are getting complaints filed against them are in the 200 to 300 range per year, generally. Of all of the health folks who are getting complaints filed against them, around 80% don't lead to any disciplinary action. So, the state would look at the case. It may or may not get to the boards, like the Board of Social Work, and then a determination was made that it was not worthy of further sanctioning. Our board, interestingly enough, our Board of Social Work, across all the health professionals, has the greatest variability in sanctioning rate over those 10-year period. So we had anywhere from a low of 9% of folks being sanctioned in any given year to as high as 60% in any given year. And that was 2014, where we saw that really high rate. So great question, Thomas. So sanctioning is the actual punishment that gets imposed upon an individual licensee if they get a complaint filed against them. So in Michigan, if you suspect that there is an ethical violation by a health professional, and I'll kind of talk through this process in a little bit, you file a complaint through LARA, the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Office, that now is done through the MyPlus system, the online portal that everyone renews and gets their licensing through. That's also now where ethical violations go through. Shelley is a former Board of Social Work member. So Shelley, I wonder if maybe you could tell us a little bit about like what happens once then a sanction gets to the board, or how it gets to the board.
Well, ask an easy question. So I want to start with correcting the word punishment because I know that the Lara board heavily says they're not punitive. It's meant to be educational to the social worker, to help the social worker to become better at their role, to help them, if they have a shortfall or they've made errors or mistakes, to help them. So sanctions can include lots of things, depending on what that case complaint is. So, for instance, someone coming in who maybe doesn't have, and the social work board doesn't really handle the lack of CEs anymore directly. But for instance, when the board itself handled those, a person coming in who maybe was dishonest and said that they had all their credits, or perhaps they just mistakenly thought they had all their credits, but then through audit, it was found that they didn't have the right credits to renew their license. So the social work board then would figure out, what we thought they needed. And, usually that would be, the sanction would be that they had to then get these credits within a certain amount of time. Um, and, the onus was on them to show that they've done it, that they've gotten accredited education, um, that they've paid any fees that are assigned to that. And then sometimes that sanction would also include fees that they would have to pay to the state of Michigan. Um, and again, generally not, anything real high or expensive, but something that sort of is that little bit of a, um, to help pay for the problem that they've caused, the charge for the work that's required for all of the staff in the office. So that would be, I'd say, a minor sanction. A heavier sanction could be something, maybe that social worker violated the code, the law, the code of law in some way. Perhaps not respecting confidentiality. That might be one that I could use as an example. And so therefore the sanction might involve something like, again, some CEs, whether you had you may have already had your CEs for that year, but we're going to require that you have additional CEs in things like confidentiality or ethics, documentation, whatever it is that, we think, again, would help you to become a better social worker. There'll probably be some sort of fee attached as well. And it's possible that there would be a condition of suspension until you met those requirements. So, that's just some simple examples of sanctions that could exist. And they can be all over the place. It's very individualized, depending on what is presented to the board, what the actual issue was. Again, the board usually decides, based on a conversation of what might help this individual become better at their job, better at being a social worker and respecting the rules and the laws and the ethics that are required.
Yeah, that's helpful, Shelley. And when we looked at the last couple of years of sanctions that were imposed on folks, specifically that had a CE requirement additionally attached, the three most common that were asked of people to complete were, not surprisingly, as we have seen in the most common violations, documentation, boundaries, and ethics. And so some of those, that's as generic as they are. Some of them had a little bit more specifics tied to them. And looking through those records, most of the sanctions are 3 CEs or 3 hours of whatever that specific type of training that we can find. Question kind of along the lines from Ken, and I'm not sure I know the answer to this. I think it's no, but Shelley, I'm curious your take from a former board perspective. Is there a limit to how many times that one could be sanctioned before they would lose their license?
I don't know that answer. I don't think so. I guess if it might depend on how serious a charge that was. If you kept repeating the same charge versus it's something new, I think all of that would come into the conversation. Um, in the time that I was on the board, I think we may have suspended people more often than anything. But I don't recall ever having a person come back for additional sanctioning or additional, charges brought against them. Again, I have limited experience. I wasn't on there forever, so but I'm not aware of anyone having come back through. Um, and again, I think it would just be a case by case basis, and it would also depend on how serious that charge was, what that charge was, whether that person. I'm just kind of free thinking what I would think as a board member myself. If it was a blatant, you've already had this charge and now you blatantly are, violating it again. I think that certainly could be a little more serious, including loss of license. Um, but I really don't know. I've never heard that there was a limit on how many sanctions or how many times you could be brought to the board. I've just never heard of it.
Yeah, there's very few cases that we saw over the last 8 years of data that we've started to poke through of people with multiple violations. There are a couple, interestingly enough, that looks like folks have swapped professions. So they've showed up in ethical violations. Maybe they started as counselor, lost their license or had issues, and then moved to like a counseling degree or something like that. So I do feel like there's maybe a loophole that Laura has to figure out of like maybe how does the person follow the license regardless of like the licensing type, because that could be a major issue if somebody is just moving to a different health license to be able to practice in a similar sort of capacity. I think related to that, my next question for the full group is I'm curious if out of the roughly 12,000 individuals that had some sort of sanction in the last 10 years, how many do you think lost their license? Well, this is a good mix of answers. So we have anywhere from 3 to 10%, which would be what, 1,200. So zero, I see a zero in there too. It's higher than zero, but of the 12,000 of all of the health professions, there were 12 in the last decade, or at least decade of available data. And those include like Larry Nassar and big name folks. And 10 of those 12 were from serious child sex criminal cases. So it takes something very, very extreme for someone to lose their license in Michigan, at least, which is, I think, probably a good thing. But also, I think I would have expected that number to be a little bit higher than that, just knowing that there probably are underreporting in ethical violations. And we'll talk about that a little bit later about what's the process? How do we make sure we're keeping our coworkers and colleagues held accountable and making sure people are getting the support that they need if they are practicing in maybe unethical manners there. Before we kind of move off this slide too, I just want to have a little bit further discussion on the continuing education side of this piece. So Judy, you're in the UP. Well, you're both up in the UP, Judy and Shelley. One of the conversations we were having as we were preparing for this is maybe the different sort of availability of continuing education and what you know of some of your colleagues that do or do not get all of their continuing education. I'm just curious your thoughts on why folks might be having this issue.
Well, we don't have a lot of presentations going on in the UP where they can go to a particular place and get their CEs, but there certainly are a lot online now, at like this conference, and I think there's a lot of these going on in the UP and statewide that we can all participate in now. But I think a lot of people just don't know that they can sign up for them.
Yeah, I think that's a reality. We often, I think there's some confusion over what people can count as continuing education. In Michigan, you can earn 100% of your CEs online. half just have to be live, like
Right.
it, right? And so absolutely, Rebecca, COVID brought a lot more live webinar options. So I don't know if we have data yet to really sense of what post-COVID CE requirement audits have looked like, but historically about 10% of the licensees in each profession get audited every year randomly. And those are the folks then who have to show the specifics of their CE courses, and then the folks at LAR determine whether or not they were approved officially or not. But yeah, absolutely. I think we want to make sure that there are in-person opportunities for people to engage and connect and network, but making sure at least minimally people have access to live content and the requirements for in Michigan, which are the 5 ethics, the 2 pain management, the 2 human trafficking, and the implicit bias training. Ken also asks, are sanctions transferable across states? It would depend on likely the state you're moving to and what the sanction was. So if your license got revoked, you would not be able to transfer your license to another state because you have to be usually in good standing in order to receive reciprocity. If you moved from, like, say, Michigan to Minnesota in the middle of having to earn X amount of additional continuing education, you still would have to complete those requirements to finish out your license renewal in Michigan before it would potentially go into further issues. I think that this is a good conversation as we have national movement around a compact, and how does your state's licensing tie to potentially portability across the country as more folks are doing telehealth, how the compact operates. And I know that's not the full topic of today, but you have to follow and maintain the license in your home state, your domiciled state. So as that piece of legislation becomes more national, it's not in Michigan yet, so and probably won't be for a couple of years. So that's the one that if and when the compact does become a part of our process here in Michigan, you still would have to maintain all of the requirements only in your home state. You wouldn't have to worry about all of the other states. But if you did end up trying to just switch your license, or if you chose not to be a part of the compact, like right now where we don't have one and you have to get licensed in each individual state, you would likely have to follow the process in each one of those jurisdictions, which gets a little bit complicated. And as it relates to, like, CE requirements, every state has slightly different CE requirements. Some of the specific courses you have to take are going to be different depending on where you move, the number of hours, how many years you have your license in each renewal cycle. All of that is not consistent across the country, which makes it very challenging for folks as we are in this new, more digital age of services. And Cynthia, I see your comment here. It's hard to find webinars, live human trafficking, pain management. Yeah, absolutely. Those are ones that we know are always important to put on and that are hot topics when we do have those. But making sure that more of those are available. Absolutely. So let me just move on from this slide here.
Duane,
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Judy.
could I speak to the telehealth? I've
Yeah,
had
please.
people ask me about the telehealth stuff and them not knowing that they cannot practice in the state of Virginia if they're on vacation and they're there for like an extended period of time, that it is illegal for them to practice in another state, even though it's telehealth.
Yeah, interstate practice is super complex and really depends somewhat on the state you're in and our home state. So Michigan's law is you must be licensed in the state your client is located in. So if you're on vacation, but your client is still in Michigan, that is technically okay by Michigan law. It may not be by Virginia law, so that's where you're going to have to, like, double check that piece. But if your client is moving or on vacation in another state, you know, there's some tiny bit of wiggle room based off of continuity of care if somebody's gone for like a week or a couple of weeks or something like that. But if they've moved and they're gone for months at a time, you're technically not allowed to continue seeing that client unless you also then have a license in that particular jurisdiction. So it is it's tricky right now, and especially with, we have a lot of these, our folks are transient, they're moving all over the place. telehealth companies are multi-state now. And so making sure that you're following the rules of the spaces that you're in. And same thing with, insurances are a little bit tricky to navigate too. I see your question here. What if it's private pay and not being billed through insurance? You still have to follow your licensing law regardless of insurances. So that's the same thing with the clients who might be in a different space. Great question, Sandy. What if they're a traveling health professional, but their home is in Michigan? So their address, I mean, that's where it's like kind of gray a little bit. It's the address is technically the space where the person is located, but physically you could potentially get into trouble from that. And so you want to be very careful in some of those situations where you have somebody who, if that might be somebody who's traveling for 50% of the year because that's part of their job. And they may not be in a consistent space, or if somebody, say, is part of the military and moving across the country, and or part of the world too. I mean, we're not even talking about the rest of the world, where that's a whole nother ball of licensing issues there. But you're all getting at this point where it is not a simple web of regulation across the country, and it is really challenging to navigate. How do we update our state laws to make sure that they are best equipped to support folks, where it is a very slow process to get anything through the regulation or our legislature right now. These are really good questions though that come through. All right, let me go ahead and move on to the next slide. So at the national level, so our national office also does ethics consultations as well as what's called professional review process. And professional review has been around pre-licensing. It kind of was the first kind of ethical violation place that folks could go to before states had licensing, where if you knew of another social worker or an NASW member who you suspected had an ethical violation, you could report them through internally within our association. And so you can see here the most common ethical violations that are found through the professional review process. Many of them mirror what we see at the state level, but commitment to clients, conflict of interest, sexual relationships, client records, dishonesty, fraud, and deception. That wasn't one that we talked about a lot in the last slide, but as it read licensing violations, that really means kind of that dishonesty, fraud, and deception. So sometimes that's somebody whose license has lapsed or is no longer valid, still presenting themselves as a social worker, where in Michigan, you have to not just be you have to graduate from an accredited program, but also be licensed and able to use the title social worker. And so we take that very seriously, and we have seen people who have lapsed for whatever reason, still out there trying to practice or practicing. And then misrepresentation can also kind of fall into that boat as well. Professional review is less widely used now because we have state regulation, but that is a secondary process that is available for folks who might need ethical support. And at the end of those processes, really the worst punishment or sanction would be removal of membership and barring membership for life through NASW. And usually that information is posted publicly, or at least in some sort of one of the journals or national magazines. Within our own state, the worst sanction generally is loss of licensing and bar of being able to get a license. So I want to use our kind of second half of our time together to talk through some of those specific ethical concerns that we are seeing in Michigan. And so I'm going to first turn it over to Shelley, our current ethics committee member and former board of social work member, to talk through some of conflict of interest pieces. And I know we've started to talk about this, but Shelley, give us some more context and maybe some cases.
Yes. So conflict of interest is 1.06 of the ethics booklet that hopefully everyone has in home or online. So in a nutshell, what this means is that the social worker is responsible to be alert and to avoid conflicts of interest. It's the social worker's responsibility to inform the client if there is a potential conflict of interest. with always keeping the client's needs primary. So, that's the point of the conflict of interest statement. This might require that you terminate a client. It might require that you refer a client if that conflict of interest demands that. The other one of the other reasons that conflict of interest is important in our ethics is because it's perceived that there could be a taking advantage of a client through some method or form. And again, the social worker is responsible for setting clear, appropriate boundaries with clients. I know Judy's going to talk about rural issues, and that's a big part that can happen with conflict of interest is that you're in a place, especially in rural settings, where conflict of interest becomes almost I can't get around it. But I'm going to let her really talk a little bit more about that. So I broke down conflict of interest. As you look through the ethics book, it's actually found in several different places in the book. There's conflict of interest that's professional. There's conflict of interest that's social, and there's conflict of interest that has to do with business. And so I'm going to break those all down a little bit with you, and also then give you just a few examples of what those might mean. So professionally, and these are actual cases that have been referred to the ethics committee at some point, or people who just contacted me directly, so I'm aware of an issue that has happened out in a community. So the first one was, and I'm looking at the professional type of conflict of interest. The social worker was threatened by a client, and then the agency that the social worker worked for did very minimal work to change the building to help this social worker feel safe or to mitigate any sort of problem that the social worker perceived as having, being afraid or fearful for practicing in that building. The social worker asked for some supervision and asked that those client visits be monitored, perhaps behind a glass, a two-way mirror. Could you, the client or the social worker asked, if I have to see this client because my agency is requiring me to do this, could I have extra supervision? Could I have extra protection? And of course, the agency came back with we can't afford this. We can't afford the extra staffing, and that the client needs to be seen, and this social worker is the person who needs to see them. That's a conflict of interest. The professional part of that is that this agency is seeing this as, you have to do this work, whether it is a conflict or not. And then to not provide this particular case was a lot more than just conflict of interest. But, to not provide safety for that social worker, which, then ends up causing the social worker to either become ill, call in sick, not service the client correctly, constantly be thinking about, her safety when she's meeting with this client, and therefore not focusing on what is in the client's best interest. What does the client need? And there's that conflict of interest that happens for that social worker. Another type of professional conflict of interest. This was a social work that facilitated a group that was with a specialized population. But the court ordered that a client be seen, be part of that group. The client or the social worker knew of this client socially. So there's also a social component here. But the professional part was that the court is saying you have to see this person, even though the person wasn't appropriate to the group. And it sets up, again, a conflict of interest where the social worker is having difficulty working with a client who is not, would not normally be part of that particular specialized group, specialized population. So you have, that kind of mix of I'm not able to do my job correctly because I have other issues with a particular client. Whether the client is aware doesn't necessarily mean anything or matter. The social worker is feeling that pressure. And then another, oh no, I'm going to skip over that because otherwise I'm going to take way too much time. All right, so some personal type of conflict of interest, and I would guess that most of you in the audience have felt this at some point. And it might be because of that, again, small town or offering specialized services where there's not a lot of other choices for people to go to. To maybe see a different social worker, they would have to travel, long distances, or, they just are not finding who they want. They may have had a referral by a friend, to go see my social worker because, they do this outstanding work. And this, again, can set up that kind of that personal or social conflict of interest, because now you're seeing the friend of a client. You might be seeing a family member of a client because they've referred you. And while it's really nice to have these referrals, it can set you up for having conflicts of interest. This happens especially in agencies where there's limited staff as well. You might have people who have a specialty practice. They see people for anxiety and depression. However, they're being asked to see people that have other issues that they're maybe less comfortable with, body dysphoria or eating disorders. But because there's limited staffing, you might be asked to see someone with issues that you are not comfortable with or that you don't know a lot about. And again, a lot of these issues tie into other things like competence. But conflict of interest plays a role in all of that as well. Another example of personal or social conflicts of interest are you have the friend at work, and this friend at work, friend in the community, and then the sister of that friend, who maybe isn't close to their sibling, wants to see you, signs up to see you. You may not even know the first time that person comes in. It might take a session or two until you realize that, oh, that's a relative. That's someone I know of. My friend has told me about their sister. And now I realize I'm sitting in front of this person. And how do I get out of this? How do I back out of this? How do I address this with this client? Again, remembering that it's the social worker's responsibility to take care of that conflict of interest if it exists. So you have that type of a situation where you can have conflict of interest. And then another one is social workers who facilitate groups, again, and have clients referred to them through the court or through, say, a family placement agency, those types of things. The person comes into service, and guess what? The social worker knows who this person is, or they know of them because they have on their client record already. They already have another family member. Say mom is seeing them for depression, and now in a group that they're facilitating, they have the child. That is the cause of the loss of that child, is the cause of or part of the cause of that depression for that adult. So you have those types of conflicts of interest, and again, how are you going to deal with that when you have a court or a family placement agency putting someone in that group and saying you have to see them? All right, sorry about that. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about has to do with a business. And this was, I thought, kind of a more unusual case. This was a social worker who had some office space that she had been placed in on quite a long time. For years, she had been in this same space, made it feel homey but it's rented space. And then a former client buys the building. And while it kind of seemed odd, and what do you do with this? My building is now owned by someone who I formerly saw as a client, and there was concerns with conflict of interest because the owner of the building has access to the office space. And then also is, able to monitor who comes and goes during sessions. And this just became another one of those very prickly kind of feelings of this doesn't feel right. And then not knowing, what do I do? I have a lease that I have to honor, or I'm going to lose a vast sum of money if I give up my lease. Where else would I go? This is my established practice. This is where people know that I am. And so it sets up that kind of conflict of, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether I should do something, whether I just have to make do with what I have. How do I make the best of this? How do I deal with this? How do I deal with that former client? How do I deal with if anyone coming in the building also knows that person? Will some of my clients now feel like spied on, for lack of a better word? So, there's these kinds of conflicts that come up. And I know all of you, probably most of our audience has had some conflict of interest with, in various ways. They're very common. I think as I look back on the questions that I've taken as part of the ethics committee, at least half of the questions that I've taken that people have phoned into our hotline have involved conflict of interest in some fashion. Again, a lot of them are more than that. It's like pickup sticks. They're conflict of interest, but there's also all these other issues that are happening at the same time. But just to kind of clean out what's the conflict of interest? How do we protect our client so that we're giving our client the best quality service that they can get? How do we protect ourselves professionally so that we are honoring our ethics? How do we deal with employers who sometimes don't want to, help us with that because it's not financially feasible for them? There's just all of these issues that arise around conflicts of interest. And with that, I'm going to move on because I want everyone else to have time and maybe some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. That's a good segue, I think, into our next conversation. I see, Christine, your comment in the chat. We'll definitely get to that before we end. I've got some thoughts on some of the macro ethical stuff that's going on right now. But I'd love for Judy to talk a little bit about some of our rural social work ethical concerns. And some of these will apply to everybody, regardless of whether you're in rural settings or not.
Shelley and I are both in a rural area up here in the UP of Michigan. Our entire county is 66,000 people, and it covers 1,800 square miles of property. So it's pretty small, but it covers a large area. And I think Shelley mentioned the facilitating groups. I facilitate a group as NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. And as a social worker in that group, when I go into that group, I have to, at the very beginning of that group, let everybody know that I'm a mandatory reporter, because I can't be in that group as a social worker and not let people know I'm a mandatory reporter. So if they report something to me, I have to do something about that. Or if they talk about it in the group, then I'm going to pull them aside and we're going to do the reporting that we have to do. I recently had a friend I'm involved in many organizations in the UP, and I'm kind of all over the place. And I recently had a friend that comes to me and tell me about a teenager that was being sexually abused. She used a name. I said, we have to report it. So we ended up having to report that, because I'm not going to not report something that could potentially be very harmful to a child. We went to the state police. We did all of the reporting. And then it's like you have to let it go, because you're not going to find out what happens a lot of times. I have worked in just about every area of social work in the UP, from substance abuse, senior services, home health, nonprofits, and I currently work for an EAP organization. I've also been born and raised in the UP, so I know lots of people and I have a large extended family. So the boundary issues, Shelley was talking about knowing people, and it's like, yeah, I have had family members appear at agencies I'm working at in a nonprofit agency. And so because of that, it's like the agency had to do precautions and I had to do precautions like if they're doing staffing, case management around a relative that I have that's in because there's nowhere else to go. Shelley mentioned that. Sometimes there's nowhere else to send somebody and they end up in your agency. It's like, so the charting on those people have to be kept totally separate from anything that I may have access to. They have to have different, I have to not be included in any case management with any of those people. There's lots of conflicts of interest around a lot of those issues when it comes to family, relatives, friends. I've had people also say to me, well, I know that this social worker over here has a substance abuse issue. Can you report it? It would be imperative to the person who has the firsthand knowledge to report those things. But often people don't want to get involved in doing those kinds of reportings. And so it doesn't get reported. Um, oh, I'm kind of at a loss. Um, I think in our small area, supervision is really important, especially if you're working in a private practice or in an agency that doesn't offer really good supervision. It's really important to have supervision and to have a network of people. When I worked in home health for many years, I was the only social worker in the agency. The other people that I worked with were all nurses. And so it was imperative for me to have social workers on the outside that I could talk to about specific, not about people, but about specific cases and specific things that were happening with patients. Sometimes a nurse would want me to do a protective services referral because they didn't think that this person should be living on their own anymore. And I would go in and say, well, they're competent, blah, 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 all of the things that make them okay to live alone, but they're not living up to the standards that the nurses wanted them to live by. Luckily, I had really good relationship with all of the protective services workers, and I could have a protective services worker go with me to a client's home so that they could back me when I went back to my supervisor and said, there's no issue with this client or this patient living on their own. And sometimes I had nurses that were not very happy with me as a social worker. But my goal was not to make the nurses happy. My goal was to do what the client wanted done, as long as they were competent to make their own choices. And I've been in homes of hoarders and people that lived in absolute squalor, but it was their choice. They get to make those choices as adults on how they live. Kids, yes, we're the voice for kids because they can't speak for themselves. But as adults, you get to live however you want to live. So those are some of my things and some of the things that have created some real angst for me in the past.
Yeah, Judy, thanks for that. That's so helpful to get some of that insight. And I'll say, we didn't talk about supervision as it relates to many of the complaints that come through, but I would say by far the majority of ethical violations, there is some supervisory component that is an issue. Either there's no peer consultation, no formal mentoring, no supervision happening, people are isolated in their practice. There's generally something like that that is part of the reason why folks then are getting ethical violations filed against them. Makes sense. I mean, if you've got a good network of people who you are connected to and bouncing ideas and dilemmas off of, you're less likely to get yourself into a problem. The last example that I'll add kind of to Judy's slide is on dual relationships. I had somebody reach out to our office just this week, and their wife owns a private practice. They're a new grad and wondering if they could get supervision if they started working at that practice. No. I mean, you shouldn't if it's your wife that is the owner of your practice. Same thing if it's a family member. You know, that's a dual relationship that you know that you would be walking into. There's a power dynamic that's at play then. As much as you can avoid some of those, we absolutely should be doing that. I know we're reaching close to the end of the time, but I do want to talk through some of what's happening nationally and what's that creating for some of our ethical concerns here. We're seeing more and more, depending on the state politics, situations where social workers are having to practice ethically in illegal state. So this relates to affirming care provision, abortion access and reproductive justice, working with undocumented folks, right? There are lots of situations that, depending on where you live across the country, may be illegal to provide services, to talk about services, to give resources out. Some states are super, super restrictive. And obviously we're seeing that mirrored nationally, although that hasn't fully trickled everywhere yet. And Michigan has more protections on some of those issues right now, but could easily change in the next election cycle. And so how do we practice and manage those relationships where historically social workers have had to live in this space where to work ethically, to work with people ethically, you might be violating a law or an agency policy. And that is the risk that we all take professionally in some of the work we do, whether that's through our formal jobs or for our advocacy work that may be outside of our day-to-day. How do we change the policy to then match with the ethics that we see, and how do we not go backwards in some of this? We're starting to see things like the VA is rolling back a lot of things, requiring all of their clinicians to go back on site. We have huge concerns around confidentiality. If there are spaces that folks are being forced to then go have their client interactions with that aren't soundproof or have designated space for client interaction. Our national office has been in connection with the federal CEO stuff. We are having a lot of odd questions around how do I advocate or protest or rally? Can I lose my license as a social worker? How do I do this ethically? It's mandated that we are politically engaged as social workers. We have a whole section 6 of our code of ethics that tells us we have to be engaged in political work and advocacy work. So how does that look like? And how do we ultimately match our ethics with our policies? And that can be at the local level, the state, the federal, or even the international level. And for our students, what does that look like at the university level or our schools of social work, where we know that there are lots of campus activism and we've seen students removed from campuses. We've seen programs shut down, activism on a whole range of topic areas. And there is not, unfortunately, a clear answer or way to navigate some of these. And so that's why collectively we have to be communicating with each other. We have to have opportunities for dialogue, for action. We've been working on licensing barriers for several years now because there are some ethical issues with how our current licensing is set up, and it's barring people from being able to practice, and it's creating systemic exits of certain groups of social workers from our profession. And so that is one of many of the things that we are grappling with, I think, as a profession at the state and national level right now. Thank you, Danielle, for dropping the eval in the chat. There are a couple of things resources-wise that I want to make sure that everyone leaves here with. So I dropped this in the chat. If you have a concern, or if there is a situation that you think raises to the level of filing an ethical violation, that again needs to be done through the MI+ system. I highly recommend, if you're considering that, please call us and we can have an ethics consultation with you. Our ethics committee is available, our staff is available. We want to make sure that we don't get to the point of having to file a violation unless we really have to. Our board of social work, there are 6 social workers and 3 public members of that. Every year, there's usually at least one appointment that's happening on that board. We want to make sure that there are social workers, good social workers who are on that, who are ultimately decide the disciplinary review of all of those folks who get a complaint filed against them. Our national office does ethics consultations a couple of days a week. So that's another resource if you have maybe a slightly more advanced ethical dilemma outside of just the state. But you've met a couple of our ethics committee members here. We have 11 members currently on our ethics committee. We may be recruiting 1 or 2 more in the next couple of months. So if that is something that you might be interested in, we also put out articles, do education, all that good stuff. We had a recent article actually just a couple of weeks ago on immigration. We'll have a series of things around the intersection of immigration and ethics over the next few months, as we know that that is a huge topic area for our social work community right now. I talked about the ethics committee. So just some other resources. So this is the line for the national ethics line. They do consultations Mondays and Wednesdays. Our ethics line, you can call it anytime, and we try to get back with people within 48 hours, whether that's a staff member or an ethics committee member. But all of our specific laws can be found in either the public health code or our general rules. So those are important ones to go back to make sure if you've got an initial question about if somebody's breaking the law specifically, we can find those there. There are a host of free trainings that are available on our national website. And then one common resource we always recommend that we tell people, if you're finding yourself in an ethical gray area, is contact whoever your liability insurance provider is, because that will at least tell you what your basic protections are if it's you who is in an ethical situation or a licensing situation. Often they can provide sometimes financial support or legal support if you get to the point where you're in an ethical violation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing there, and I know we're at time. So for folks who have to pop off, thank you for sticking around. Thank you, Shelley and Judy. We'll stick around for a few minutes to answer some questions that come through. I appreciate everyone being on. And I see Kate's question. Can you share how you get involved with the NASW Ethics Committee? Yeah, great question. So I will drop the link on where you can put your interest there for the state ethics committee. At the national level, we almost always have a Michigan person on our national ethics team, which is great. We want to have our folks there. Our ethics committee meets monthly. I think it's the 4th Friday of every month. We normally meet from 9 to 10 a.m. And then ethics consults kind of just get split amongst the group depending on folks' expertise. And I'd say our ethics consultations come through almost every week. We have at least one that will go to our ethics committee. And so I'm going to just drop our whole committee list here, but you can see if you have an ethics question, you can put a virtual consultation, or you can call the office. And then there is a link there too, where you can sign up potentially for the ethics committee.